Hi everyone, welcome to a new week in our journey through Mark's Gospel. We've got to chapter 6. The chapter begins by telling us of a visit that Jesus made to his hometown of Nazareth. He speaks in the synagogue and the people's response is twofold. On the one hand, they are amazed, as verse 2 says. That's a characteristic response when people hear Jesus making the scriptures clear. But on the other hand, they are dismissive of him. They take offense at him. Jesus is amazed at their lack of faith, and it says he couldn't do any miracles there. Now that doesn't mean, I think, that he was physically unable to do any miracles, as if such things were dependent upon others somehow, because after all, he does actually heal some people here. It means that such works in the face of persistent unbelief, as we have here, would be inappropriate. We then read of the 12 being sent out on a mission trip through the area. Their understanding of Jesus is still pretty limited, as we see here, but their message is that people should repent, turning away from sin and to God. And the manner in which they are sent is an indication that there is an urgency about repenting and about the things of God. We then get a fairly lengthy story about John the Baptist. It's told as a flashback, and the occasion is that Herod, the local ruler, has heard about the ministry of Jesus. He concludes that John the Baptist has come back from the dead because he has had John put to death. Herod clearly has a guilty conscience, and we see that he should have a guilty conscience as Mark explains the story to us. Herod is in this immoral relationship with Herodias, who was his brother's wife, but also his niece. And John has pointed that out to him. Herod had him thrown in jail, but he also liked to listen to John. And that illustrates perhaps something of our fallen human nature that's both aware of the truth of God on the one hand, and yet not always willing to submit to it on the other hand. Well then, at this dreadful birthday party, his wife Herodias uses her daughter to get him to execute John. But what we see here is that he is reaping a dreadful cost for his actions. He now has this crushing sense of guilt that leads him to think that John the Baptist is somehow haunting him. Later, actually, we find in Luke's Gospel that when Jesus is arrested just before the crucifixion, he appears briefly before Herod. Herod asks him questions, but Jesus remains silent. God has nothing more to say to Herod at that point. Mark has told us, you remember, in his opening chapter that Jesus' message was to repent and believe. The disciples in chapter 6 verse 12 here have preached that people should repent. John the Baptist had called Herod to repent. And in telling us this story, Mark is making clear to us the terrible consequences of refusing to repent and refusing the claims of Christ in our lives. The chapter closes with two well-known stories that further underline who Jesus is. Jesus first teaches a large crowd, 5,000 men, undoubtedly many women and children as well. And he challenges the disciples to provide food for them. It's impossible for them to do that. It would have cost the equivalent of thousands of pounds. But of course, Jesus miraculously provides for them as he multiplies the loaves and the fishes. Now, this is an echo of several Old Testament stories. Stories where God provides food for his people. So manna in the wilderness, for example, the Lord feeding the sheep in Psalm 23 and Ezekiel 34. Jesus is clearly doing the things that God does. Why? Because that is who is amongst us. And then Jesus sends the disciples ahead of him across the lake while he prays. And Jesus then walks out to them on the water. Now, as we saw when Jesus calmed the storm, the control of the seas is something that only God can do. But you notice the eyewitness detail from Peter, presumably, in verse 48, where it says he was about to pass them by. On some occasions in the Old Testament, God appeared to people like Moses and Elijah, and he was said to pass by. Then also, Jesus says in verse 50, "It is I," or "I am He." It's an allusion to the way God spoke of Himself in the Old Testament, the "I am" statement. So you see that Jesus is doing the things, again, that God does. So Mark is helping us see who Jesus is. I hope as you're reading this gospel, you're seeing that as well. And he's helping us see the need that we have to turn our lives around to Jesus. Well, we're going to see much more as the chapters unfold. Read chapter 7. I'll see you tomorrow.